Hi everyone. Wanted to talk today about clinical psychology and faith. And as you know, LCC is a Christian institution, although I know not all the students who are attending LCC are Christians. But I think it's just important to think about how faith and our faith, whether it's as Christians or if we work with people from other faiths or if we're from another faith ourselves, how that affects the work we do in clinical psychology. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about just some different aspects of that, the research behind it, kind of the history of it, and some ways we can appropriately use faith in practice, and then also sometimes the faith might cause problems for people. So we'll talk about all of that today. I wanted to mention that over the last 30 years or so, since the late 1980s or 1990s, early 1990s, psychology has actually been increasingly open to studying religion and spirituality. I'm talking about faith, but we kind of break it down further into two different concepts, religion and spirituality. And we'll talk more about what those mean in a moment. One of the reasons that psychology has moved to looking more at spirituality and religion is that we understand that it's really hard to know what our clients are all about unless we understand their spiritual and religious beliefs. For a lot of people, their faith is one of the key determinants of who they are. It's one of the key pieces of their personality and who they are. And so we need to understand that if we're going to work with them clinically. There's been a lot more study by researchers of topics like spirituality and religion. And what research has found is that spirituality and religion tend to be protective factors in regard to mental and physical health and substance abuse. So basically what we see is that people's mental and physical health is better and they use substances less when they're religious and spiritual. And that's been a finding kind of that's just been repeated time after time. There's been more publication of articles in professional journals on spirituality and religion. And then finally, we're also talking this week about cultural competence. And one of the things we've realized is that we need to understand that spirituality and religion, that faith, this is an element of culture. This is part of our culture. And so when we're trying to understand someone's culture and to be culturally competent in working with them, religious beliefs fit into that larger definition of culture. I wanted to just define a couple of concepts that I've been using, spirituality and religion. Spirituality, remember this is, when you think about this, remember that spirituality is more personal. So it's a personal response to God or a higher power or an animating force in the world. And it's much more individualized. Whereas religion is much more about a set of beliefs that's shared among a group of people. And it would be the practices, the rituals, the forms of governance that define how those beliefs are expressed. And so you might think about churches, right, where churches have doctrine and they've got rituals and they have a group of people coming together. So spirituality is much more individualized and personal, whereas religion is much more corporate or much more centered in a group and often is a bit more formal. There's some different ideas about how religion and spirituality fit together. Some people would say that the diagram on the left is a way to define it, that there's spirituality and there's religion, and then there's some common areas. So some people are both religious and spiritual, but other people could be spiritual but not religious, or religious but not spiritual. The second way of believing or of thinking about this is that spirituality is the bigger idea, the bigger concept, and then religiousness is a smaller part of that. So you could be spiritual but not religious, but if you're religious, you'd have to be spiritual. You'd have to be also on a personal level seeking God. That's not going to be on a test or anything, but just wanted you to know there's a couple of different ways that researchers think about spirituality and religion and how they fit together. Excuse me. Some recent history, as I mentioned earlier, the helping professions, psychology among them, are increasingly recognizing the importance of assessing the role of spirituality and religion in consumers' lives, in the lives of the clients they work with. The Joint Commission, which in the US is the commission that accredits all hospitals, now requires a spiritual assessment. And it can be a very basic spiritual assessment. It can just basically be asking someone if they have a religious belief system and if they'd like somebody from their religion, a priest or a pastor, to be involved in their medical care. I want to talk a little bit about something called a spiritual assessment. In helping people, you all know from the times that we've talked about the clinical psychology helping process that we start off with an assessment. Sometimes it's important to include spirituality or religion in that assessment process. And so there's a couple reasons we might ask at least a few basic questions about faith. One is if we think faith, spirituality, religion is related to the person's culture. If someone comes in and says, I'm a Muslim, often we would want to know more about that. And one of the reasons we might want to know about that is people who are very observant Muslims often have rules about whether they can be alone with people of the opposite sex. And so if I was a male therapist working with an Islamic woman, it might not be appropriate for me to be alone with her. She might be better off with a female clinician. And so we'd want to ask about those kinds of things, because that religious faith might also be related to culture, and we might need to know about some of those cultural values. We'd also want to know, because sometimes we want to know at least a little bit about faith, because sometimes faith is a strength or a resource for our clients. It can be a coping skill. Some of my research has found that for at least college-age women, if they're using other skills such as prayer, Bible study, being involved in church, when they're feeling stressed, when they have a problem, they actually tend to drink alcohol less. And so, we call that religious coping. That religious coping can be a support for them when they're going through a tough time. Faith can also be a source of social support. There are people from my church who care about me, and if I'm going through a tough time, they'll be helpful to me. And if I was in therapy, I'd want my therapist to know that, to understand that there were people there who could be good social support for me. And also, as I already mentioned, faith might affect service provision. And my example of that was the Islamic woman who might actually be more comfortable with a therapist of her own sex rather than a male therapist. Sometimes we need to get a bit more detailed in our spiritual assessment, and there might be a few reasons for this. If a client comes in saying that spirituality or faith is a concern, there's something I'm worried about in terms of my faith, or if it's a really important support system in that person's life, we might want to know more about it. Also, we might just want to know more if the client comes in and says, this is really important to me, as they're responding to other questions about culture and that sort of thing. So some of the things we might do if we were going to dig a bit deeper into what's going on with somebody spiritually, we might ask about their spiritual background, their family's religious beliefs, their early experiences with faith. Did they grow up in the church, or did they grow up in a family that never really talked about God? We want to talk about transitions. Often people leave home and they decide, well, maybe I don't believe what my parents believed. I'm going to figure this out for myself. And then we'd also want to know what they currently believe. Some other questions we might want to ask. We might want to ask about whether they feel a sense of pleasure or coping, or whether hope comes from their spiritual experiences. Do they sit in church and feel this overwhelming feeling of peace and calm? And we want to know about how they experience their spiritual practices. We want to know what sorts of behaviors and practices they're involved in. Do they attend church? Do they pray regularly? Do they read a sacred text regularly? We want to know who the important people in their faith life would be. Is that a priest or a pastor or, a spiritual director, someone like that? We want to know the basis for their spiritual beliefs. What do they believe and what's important about that? And what do the beliefs tell the client about the issues they're facing? This would be a very different conversation. If somebody said, I feel depressed and I think that's the devil and that's demons oppressing me, that's very different from I feel depressed and I think it's because of a brain chemistry imbalance. And so understanding what the client's beliefs might tell them about the issues they're facing is going to be really important for how we work with them. Might also want to know about their sense of their relationship with God. When I teach this class in person, I tell more stories because we have a little more time, but I had a client one time who really didn't believe God loved her. And she came from a family where mom and dad didn't show much love for her. In fact, mom and dad told her, we wish we would have just left you at the hospital and never brought you home. And so she had that same sense of her relationship with God, that she felt like it was maybe the same as a relationship with her parents. Maybe God, we talk about God being our father or our parent. A lot of people find that as very comforting, but if you haven't had a good relationship with your parents, that may not be a comforting thing. So we want to know more about that relationship. We want to know about the relationship between your faith and your values. What does your faith tell you should do? And what's it tell you about what's important? Then we want to know about the role of intuition or mystical experiences. Some faith groups really believe and place a high value, on mystical experiences, on things like speaking in tongues, right? There are some charismatic or Pentecostal Christian groups that actually feel like it's really important for you to be able to speak in another language, in a prayer language. And that's something that may happen for them during worship. And so we want to know if that's a part of their experience. Some cautions or some things to remember when we're talking about this with clients. we'd want to be culturally appropriate, especially when we're talking about God, because a lot of us have ideas about God. They may not be our client's ideas about God. And so we're going to have to try to understand, what does our client think about God? Even in terms of using the male gender for God, some people are very comfortable with that and offended if you don't use it. Other people really don't like the idea that God is a man, and they'd say, well, that feels sexist to me. And so we'd have to try to understand in their culture and their understanding what's sort of the appropriate way to talk about all this. We also need to remember, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, but we need to remember that for some people, religion and spirituality can become distorted, and it can actually be a problem instead of a strength. And so even though I've talked about the research and how for most people being involved in their faith is a really helpful, protective thing, sometimes it's not so much. Sometimes people are involved in a set of beliefs or in a sort of faith that really is sort of harmful to them. One example of this would be that for a long time, it was common for priests and for pastors to counsel women who were being abused to stay with the abuser. And they'd say, God wants you, if you're married to that person, God wants you to submit to them. The Bible says wives are supposed to submit to their husbands. I don't teach that. I don't believe that, but certain people have said that. And so that would be an example of a time when religious faith could be distorted to actually keep somebody, if the person who hears that at church internalizes that, comes to believe that, they may stay and they may be hurt or even killed by an abuser because of that religious belief. And so we'd want to know that, and we'd want to understand that there's times we might actually have to try to work, help the person to re-examine that belief, because it might be doing something really, really dangerous for them. I want to talk just a bit about spiritual interventions. These are ways that we can use spirituality and religion, faith, in practice. A formal definition for spiritual intervention would be a therapeutic strategy that incorporates a religious or spiritual dimension as a central component of the intervention. So let me give you one example of this. It's what's called spiritually modified cognitive behavioral therapy. And you all know from other classes, and even we went over this briefly at the beginning of this class, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. In that approach to therapy, the therapist spends a lot of time identifying and trying to help people change cognitive distortions. These are false beliefs. And also problematic self-talk. What are the messages that the client's telling themselves that are causing problems for them? So spiritually modified CBT, it uses the CBT approach, but it brings the client's faith in to help with the CBT process. For example, as a Christian, if I was doing this with a client who was also a Christian, because Christianity teaches that God is love and God's our Father, if I felt like the client had a really distorted perception of themselves, really low self-image, but if they're serious about their faith, I might say, okay, so you see yourself as basically worthless. How do you think God sees you? And the client might say, well, I know God made me and God loves me. And so then we might start to use that belief about God and what the client believes that God sees in them to start to change their perception of themselves. So hopefully you understand this, where we're using faith as a part of our intervention in the counseling process, in the therapy process. I wanted to talk a little bit about some barriers that we face in involving spirituality in practice, because honestly, there's a lot of people that aren't very comfortable with this. Even though it's been talked about a lot more and studied, there's a lot of folks that really aren't very comfortable with this. One reason for this is that people who were trained earlier, people who are in the later stages of their career, older therapists, their training usually said, no, you shouldn't talk about faith with clients. You shouldn't bring that in, even if the client wants to. A lot of this was because of Freud. You might remember Freud said that religion is the universal neurosis. And he said, it sort of keeps us in this adolescent state where we never really grow up. And so if you were trained that way, if you were trained as a Freudian, you might be pretty resistant to involving faith in practice. There's also, in terms of philosophically, both modernist and postmodernist philosophical perspectives sometimes work against involving faith in practice. I want to say this: modernism is focused very much on science and the use of kind of reason and rationality. And so often people who were trained in more of a modernistic mindset, they're going to say that, well, I don't really believe in anything outside of what I can sense or experience empirically, through my senses, through my reason. And so they're really maybe going to be closed off to spiritual influences and spirituality being involved in practice. People who were trained in a more postmodern perspective, those perspectives are actually more open to spirituality and religion, because they kind of say, well, who am I to say that what I believe is what you need to believe? And so even though I don't believe in faith, I'm open to you believing in it. It could be a good thing for you. So sometimes actually people who were trained in a more postmodern sense or more postmodern perspective are actually more open to talking about spirituality and religion with clients. The difference there between the client and the therapist in that case might be that somebody who is trained in a postmodern perspective, they're not going to accept the value judgments or the value claims of the religious faith. And so if faith that says this is wrong and this is right, a postmodernist is going to say, well, that's all a matter of perspective. But they'll probably at least be open to talking about that. The modernism, postmodernism thing won't be on a test, but if you're learning about that in philosophy, or if you've had classes that talk about that, I wanted to just sort of mention how that plays out in psychology. A few other barriers we run into if we want to involve faith with our clients. One thing is a lot of the people we work with might be closeless. And I mentioned a minute ago that some of that's because of the training that they might have received. There have been some studies, and some of these are a while ago now, but we think this is still generally true. There have been studies that have shown that many people, licensed professional counselors, LPCs, clinical social workers, psychologists, far fewer of them believed in God than the general population. In general, the general population in the US, about 70 to 80% of people believe in God, but you can see for a lot of the people who are doing therapy, it's less than 50% of those people believe in God. So, and there's other polls that have kind of found that. The Gallup poll I cited, 95% of American adults believe in God or universal spirit. That's gone down a bit since that study. We now think it's more in the 70s or low 80s. But you can see it's still almost double what mental health professionals, the number of mental health professionals who have some sort of faith. So we just need to remember that our profession, if you go into clinical psychology, our profession tends to be a bit more closed off to spiritual and religious influences than the general population would be. Something that can come up in practice that I wanted to mention, hopefully you've learned about countertransference. This is how the way that I believe or feel can affect my work with my client, how I might project things from my experience onto my client. And it's something, a big part of doing therapy successfully is controlling countertransference issues. And so there's a couple ways countertransference can come out in practice. One is that if faith isn't important to the therapist, and I see previous slides, I talked about how for many therapists, faith isn't important. They may overlook the importance of the client. They may subconsciously think, oh, this really isn't anything that's important. I'm not going to spend much time on it with my client. Conversely, there's another thing that might happen. If faith is very important to me, as a Christian, if I'm working with a client, I want them to be a Christian. I'm hoping that they come to believe the way I believe. But if I impose my faith on them, that's not a good situation. There's this thing in some forms of Christianity where they talk about a crisis conversion, where my life's really bad, I'm going through a crisis, and that leads me to faith. We want to be very careful that we're not trying to sort of push our clients into that. They're going through a hard time, and we're using that to try to convert them to our faith, because that's an abuse of our power as professional therapists. I want to just mention a little bit about faith-based denial and resistance. For a while in my career, I worked at a Christian clinic. So it was a Christian ministry where we did therapy for people with substance abuse and some mental health disorders as well. And what I found was that some of the clients who came in and actually were the people who knew the most about the Bible and were most serious about their faith, sometimes they had a very distorted view of faith that actually prevented their healing or their growth. And so this is an important issue, as spiritual assessment and spiritual interventions become more commonplace, we're going to know more about these things, and they might come up. The client might realize we're comfortable talking about faith, and they might sort of bring up some of these distortions of faith that we might have to deal with in our therapy sessions. And in many ways, these things like denial and resistance, they're the same as non-faith-based denial and resistance, but in this case, they're manifested through spiritual or religious means. So I'll just give you a couple examples of what I mean by faith-based resistance and denial. I had a client one time who said, God's just healed me from using drugs. I don't need to do anything else. I don't need therapy. I don't need to go to Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. I don't need anybody to hold me accountable. He's just healed me. So that'd be an example of a distortion of faith. We know if you believe in God, we believe God could do that kind of miracle. but we also know he usually doesn't. Usually you have to go through therapy, you have to go through a treatment program, you have to be very careful who you hang around with, who you're spending time with, because you don't want to fall back into those same patterns. So that would be an example of the kind of distortions of faith that could be something we'd have to address clinically. I hope this has been helpful. I know typically at LCC, students come from a variety of backgrounds in terms of faith, and I've had students who are very serious about faith and other ones for whom it really isn't important. But because we're a Christian university, because we talk about faith in a lot of different contexts, I wanted you to think at least a little bit about how faith ties in with what we do as clinical psychologists and what is and isn't appropriate in terms of involving faith. We never want to use our position as therapists to try to force faith on someone. That would be an abuse of our power. Okay, hopefully this was helpful. I hope you're all having a good semester. And as always, let me know if you have any questions or if there's anything I can help with. Okay, have a good week.